Thanks everyone for coming. Let's get started. Happy November 21st to all the participants across many time zones to this Chemical Sciences Roundtable webinar on artificial intelligence and limited data. Of note, today is National Gingerbread Cookie Day for all of those who celebrate. This is the third and final webinar in a series of three, and this topic will conclude with a workshop in Washington, D.C. in February of 2025 on AI and drug discovery. The previous webinar in the series focused on AI and scalability, and the event following today's topic, like I mentioned, is on drug discovery, and it will be February 20th and 21st, 2025. The workshop is still in the planning stages. To follow the activities of the Chemical Sciences Roundtable and to join our email list, please use this QR code. And as this presentation is being recorded and will be made available online, you can access this QR code at a later time. So no fret if you missed this slide. A few notes about housekeeping as we get started on this Zoom webinar. As I mentioned, it is being recorded. Online only, the cameras and microphones of the panelists and the staff will be accessible. And please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to propose questions that we can answer later in the presentation. A little bit about who's involved with this webinar. The two staff members there was three staff members. I'm Mike Janicki, and I'm currently leading the Chemical Sciences Roundtable at the Academies. Kay Wims is our research assistant helping out, and Darlene Gross is in the background working on making us look good and doing all of our program management needs. The members of the Chemical Sciences Roundtable are listed here with Professors Marty Burke and Nikki Pople as the chairs. We note that there are members and ex officio members, with the ex officio members, individuals who join the roundtable based on their current roles, mostly in the U.S. government. Having members from academia, industry, and the government is a real strength of the Academy's roundtable, and we really appreciate the hard work and time these volunteers give to this fun programs. And none of these activities would happen without the sponsorship from the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy Office of Science. One last item, after we get started, there will be a survey provided to the attendees following the webinar. Please take a little time and complete the survey for our team. Having your input will help us improve our webinars and build from this one in the future. So let's get started with today's webinar. Today we have Johannes Hoschman and Stefan Mohr. Johannes Hoschman is an associate professor of chemical engineering at the University of Buffalo and is the director of the engineering science with a data science focused graduate program. Is a leadership member of the University of Buffalo Institute for Artificial Intelligence and Data Science, and a faculty member of the New York State Center of Excellence in Materials Informatics. The research of the Hoschman Group is based on molecular and materials modeling with virtual high throughput screening and modern data science using machine learning, artificial intelligence, and informatics. Stefan Mohr is the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Nexmol. Previously, he worked as a researcher at the Barcelona Supercomputer Center in Spain, the CEA in Grenoble, and the University of Basel in Switzerland. Stefan holds a Ph.D. in physics and is an expert in molecular simulations and chemical informatics, both with respect to algorithmic developments and applications. Moreover, he has a large experience in co-development and high-performance computing. On the webinar today are the two of the CSR members, Carlos Gonzalez and Jonathan Wild. Carlos is also going to moderate the discussion. Carlos is currently the chief of the Chemical Sciences Division at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, better known as NIST, a division of NIST in charge of providing the chemical function within the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Before joining NIST in 1997, Carlos worked as a quantum chemistry expert at the Pittsburgh Superconducting Center. His research interests focus on the development and implementation of reliable and efficient quantum chemistry methodologies in the study of physical and chemical properties of a wide variety of chemical systems. Jonathan Wild, who's helped plan this webinar, serves as the technical director for Assured Flow Solution, a specialist chemical flow assurance laboratory servicing the oil and gas industry. Prior to his work at AFS, John worked for Clariant Oil and Mining Services for 20 years, where he spent 10 of those years as global innovation head, where he oversaw the innovation and development advancement across multiple Clariant Oil and Mining Services channels. John has also been a fellow co-author with Stefan Moore, one of the panelists today. With that, I will pass the mic over to Carlos Gonzalez, and we can get started on today's webinar.
Well, thank you, Mike. I'm really excited to actually help coordinate this webinar, which is very timely, and I'm very excited to see what the discussions are going to be. So what we're going to have today is actually, as we said before, it's going to be Johannes Hatchman and then Stefan Moore. Each one will have 20 minutes to actually tell us a little bit more about challenges, best practices, and opportunities related to data and AI models. So without further ado, and please actually let me remind the audience, you're welcome to submit your questions to the chat so we can actually collect those and actually go forward and ask the panel. Following that, the two presentations, we are going to have a series of Q&As from the panel organizers, and also we're going to open that for discussions with the general participants. So without further ado, let's move on and go with Johannes Hatchman. Johannes, the floor is yours.
Okay, let me share my slides. All right, so I hope you can see my slides. Yeah, my name is Johannes Hachmann, and I'm very excited to be a part of this roundtable today. Thanks so much to the organizers for inviting me. And yeah, I'd like to start by reminding people that if you look at the research landscape in the chemistry community, the last 10 years or so have really seen a shift in the paradigm change towards data-driven research. And so data-driven research includes techniques like virtual high-throughput screenings using traditional physics-based computational chemistry, tools like cheminformatics and materials informatics, data mining, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, and all these other techniques that really have started to drive the progress in the chemistry and materials field. The big push for this paradigm change has come for the materials community really in 2011 with the White House Materials Genome Initiative that for the first time made a concerted effort to in putting money behind this idea of using data science techniques in the materials domain. In chemistry, this took a bit longer. In 2017, we had the data-driven discovery initiative that really did something similar for the chemistry community. Now, again, so today's talk is about AI, but it's I think worth distinguishing AI and machine learning and deep learning as these terms are bandied around quite liberally. I was encouraged to give a bit of a definition of what these different words mean so that we're all on the same page. Now, so machine learning is really a field or including a class of techniques that has the purpose of generating data-derived prediction models. So you start out with data, and then you use these tools from machine learning to create so-called surrogate models that allow you to make predictions that, again, so are based on data. So once you have these prediction models, you can make predictions for other things. Now, deep learning is a particular class of machine learning algorithms, this particular class uses multi-layer neural networks or deep neural networks, and there can be quite sophisticated architectures of how you connect the different layers and the neurons in those different layers. Oftentimes, people kind of talk about machine learning versus deep learning. Really, I think this is kind of artificial. So deep learning is just one particular machine learning algorithms. Now, so what is the difference between machine learning and AI? Well, AI is really kind of a set of tools and techniques that allow you to interact with machine learning in a human-like fashion. That means you can produce inputs or outputs using natural language. You can kind of facilitate decision making and all these different things. And at the heart of, again, so the interaction is really still a machine learning kernel. So we use AI quite liberally these days. My personal feeling is that really the difference between AI and machine learning for our field, the chemistry field and the materials field, is yeah, so we really still mostly use machine learning. So the things that go beyond machine learning are nice add-ons. Again, so having a human-like input, a human-like output. But at the end of the day, so the most important part is really to create machine learning prediction models that make predictions in a fast and efficient way. All right, so as I mentioned, these models, AI models, machine learning models, deep learning models, they all are based on data, and that means that there is a need for access to training data of sufficient quality and quantity. So that's kind of a key issue that we are dealing with. Now, I like to use this quote by Sherlock Holmes, kind of as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle introduced it. So data, 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 he cried impatiently. I can't make bricks without clay. So again, so you need data in order to build these AI or machine learning models, and you can't really do without. Now, so okay, well, so that's nice to recognize. The big challenge here really is that, well, so in the chemistry or materials community, where does the data come from? Well, so data typically comes from experiment or physics-based modeling like quantum chemistry or condensed matter physics or molecular simulations. And so that's nice and good. But generally, this data that we need to build our AI models or machine learning models is rather expensive to generate. Right, so if you are doing experiments, doing these experiments or running sophisticated first principles calculation, that's generally quite expensive, and we end up in a situation that we can just generate so much data. So we're typically in a data sparse regime. So there are a couple of exceptions here where we are lucky that we can generate a lot of data very quickly, but for the most part, chemistry and materials research is a data sparse field because, again, so the generation of the data either by experiments or by modeling is very expensive. All right, so there's a good news here because AI and machine learning can actually help you to decide which data to generate. And so again, so techniques that are useful here are Gaussian processes, for instance, or Bayesian inference or active learning. The idea here is that not all data is created equal. There's data with larger information yield and there's data with smaller information yield. And really what these tools that I mentioned before try to do is they try to identify data with the largest information yield. And that basically means that those are the data points that optimize your model the most and will give you the biggest bang for your buck. And again, so again, these techniques help you to generate data sets with the again, so with the least number of data points that still give you good prediction models. All right, okay, so AI and machine learning can actually do something to alleviate some of the problems of the sparse data situation. All right, so what other issues do we have to keep an eye on? So data that we can obtain for our models can come from heterogeneous sources. And it can also be heteroscedastic, meaning that of varying quality. So yeah, so again, so different sources can mean that you can get for the same property you might be interested in, you can get data from, again, different operators, different instruments, different kinds of calculations. And again, so that's a situation that you may encounter. And again, so heteroscedastic means that, well, so maybe you've got a couple of data points with very good quality, so small error bars, and then you've got a bunch of data points with big error bars. Now, oftentimes we can't really avoid pooling small data sets from various sources because, again, so if you only have, let's say, 3 or 4 data sets that are all small, you want to build a data-derived model on this, again, so that might be your only choice. Pooling those smaller data sets of different origin to a larger one. But again, so that's problematic because, again, so they come from different origins and have their individual issues. The same is true for the heteroscedastic data again. So oftentimes you cannot afford discarding low quality data if that's the majority of the data that you have, and you can't typically just rely on the high quality data. And again, so those are both issues, right? So if you're mixing data from different origins or of different quality, you're kind of mixing apples and oranges, and then you hope that you get something value added out of that, but it's not a given. So you actually have to work hard. So you have to somehow make the best of it, and that can mean that you want to account for the difference of the different data sets by kind of labeling it with metadata, so making sure that we keep track of the origin of the different data and also keep track of the error bars. And then we build AI or machine learning models that are cognizant of the data, training data quality. So for instance, if you've got data with bigger error bars and data with smaller error bars, you may want to add different weights to them a priori. So basically, high quality data gets larger weights than low quality data. And again, so that's something to be mindful of. All right, another issue that oftentimes comes up is the use of legacy data from the literature, right? So again, so the literature provides us with a vast source of data, but it's actually somewhat curious data. It's hard to access, right? So oftentimes the data is somewhere in a diagram. It comes with units and unit systems, some of them archaic if you go far enough back in the literature. There's context to the literature. To the information in the literature. And again, so getting that access to that data is generally quite difficult. And a lot of people have invested a lot of time in getting access to that data. But even if you are successful in getting to that data, there's still the so-called publication bias. Because if you look at the literature, what do people typically put into the literature? Well, they put the successes that they have into the literature, but not so much their failures. And that's a problem. So because that means that your prediction models that are based on literature data and these that are kind of subject to these publication biases systematically overestimate successes rather than failures, and that's a problem. So this is kind of my personal view, but again, so there's a lot of effort being put into scraping data from the literature, and it may not ultimately be worth it. In certain situations, in certain scenarios, you might be better off to systematically generate new data as long as that's an option. And the emergence of robotics and autonomous labs these days might be the way to get there. All right, that's a story about legacy data. There's also the issue of idealizing or approximate data, right? So some data is cheaper or easier to obtain than others, but the other data might be more relevant to what you want to do. And well, so the cheaper the data is, the typically the more accessible it is, and it might be available in larger quantities. So to give you an idea, so for instance, if you want to build a machine learning model or an AI model for the ionization potential or electron affinity, if you want to get that from DFT calculations, for instance, that's relatively complicated. It's much easier to compute HOMO or LUMO energies. But again, a HOMO and a LUMO energy are different to an ionization potential and an electron affinity. So there is a systematic gap here. But we may still want to use that easily accessible data. So in those scenarios, we can use techniques from transfer learning to kind of bridge this gap between the approximations and the idealizing nature. In particular, if we've got systematic differences here, we can use those techniques to correct the approximate nature of the data and calibrate to get to something that's more realistic. All right, so another issue that we should keep our eyes on is that the data needs to build our machine learning models are a priori actually unknown. So in certain scenarios, you may get away with, let's say, 12 data points. In others, you may need 1 million data points or 10 million data points. And in the beginning, you typically don't know. It will very much depend on what kind of properties you are trying to model, what kind of model types you're trying to build, and the featureizations that you need and that you build for those models. So one instance is that, let's say, deep neural network models are very popular these days. And again, so sophisticated versions of that, like graph convolutional neural networks or other architectures. Featureizations, again, so you can do something quite sophisticated like neural fingerprints. The problem is that these very sophisticated model types and featureizations, they're actually quite data hungry. And so you need a lot of data in those scenarios. What you really want to do is you want to optimize your models and your featureizations very carefully with respect to the data availability. Again, so if you only have a very limited amount of data, you want to be conservative with the flexibility, for instance, of the model you're trying to build, and you want to very carefully select the featureization that you base your model on. Then kind of another technique that you can then use is to monitor the learning rate as you're generating training data. The training data generation is typically the bottleneck of what we're trying to do. And again, so you can monitor how the machine learning model improves. And at some point, you will see that the learning rate will saturate, and at that point, having more training data will not be beneficial, and you can may as well stop generating more training data. So in that case, you are figuring out what the data needs of your model actually are. All right, another point I wanted to make is what kind of models we actually want to build. And I like to distinguish here between global and local models. So global models are again, so as global and as widely applicable as possible. Local models will only work for certain properties, for certain compound classes or chemical subspaces. And really, we have to think carefully of what we would like to be able to do with our models. How general do we want to make our models, or how general do we need our models to be? So the less ambitious we are here, the less demanding those models will be in terms of time. And so in this little cartoon down here, you can see that if you're breaking up the entirety of your data and you're trying to find subdomains in your data, you can build separate models, prediction models in those subdomains, and each of them will be much less data hungry than trying to build a global model that encapsulates and reflects all the data points. There's a downside to being less ambitious, and that's that we still want to consider the need for range of the needed range of applicability. In chemistry, we typically want to make extreme value predictions, so predictions where we're trying to find, let's say, the compound with the best properties and the largest values for something. The problem here really is that we typically don't have much training data in those scenarios. And that means that our models will perform worse here. And that means that we'll have to optimize the models in that regime. So again, so the take-home message here is that we want to carefully design the model scope, so what our models can do, and then the training set that allow us to get there. All right, so if you've got limited data, there's always the danger of overfitting. So if you've got plentiful data, that's typically less of an issue, but if you've got small data set, there's always a danger of overfitting. And that means that you want to enforce best practices that are all known. I mean, so things like cross-validation, different validation or test strategies, the use of regularization, the way you select your features and kind of the size of your feature space. You want to kind of assess different and detailed error metrics to see how your model is performing. Those are all kind of solved problems. It's just that the community is not necessarily aware of these tools, and that means we really should enforce that these tools and techniques are actually used kind of by the community. Otherwise, we are producing models that are not performing the way we want them to perform. So to wrap this up, overall, there is a need for the development of AI and machine learning for small and/or heteroscedastic data, because that's typically the scenario that we have. That's not typically the priority of the computer science community, because they oftentimes deal with problems in the big data regime, right? So if you have a computer scientist that works with a bank in technical chart analysis on the stock market, they've got all the data that they want. Or if you want to build a generative AI approach to make new cat pictures, there are a bazillion different cat pictures on the internet. So you are very much in a data-rich regime. we are not that. So we typically have to somehow make do with small data. And I think pushing the CS community to help us out there is going to be important. If we're successful with that, I think we may have a nice impact on other domains with the same data sparseness that is kind of underserved these days as well. All right, so this is kind of my take on AI with small data here. Again, these 7 bullet points that I discussed here, and I think my time should be roughly up.
Well, thank you so much, Johannes, for a very, very exciting presentation. In the spirit of keeping with the time, I think we should move to the next one, given by Stefan Moore. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I will also share my screen. Good. Yes, perfect. So I hope you can see them. Yeah.
Yes.
Great. Perfect. So now after this first talk by Johannes, introducing a little bit the basics of AI with sparse limited data. Now my presentation is more about how can we make kind of a business out of this. So how can we? What's the idea behind our company? Next small. So we are, just very briefly, we are a spin-off company of the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, founded in 2019, so about 5 years ago. And we are working in computational chemistry. Later on, I will explain you what this means exactly. So what we are doing is we offer a software as a service platform to accelerate R&D in the chemical industry, and we are molecular modeling and artificial intelligence, or we should maybe rather call it machine learning. So also due to some, let's say, marketing, sometimes we use these terms together, even though we shouldn't. So our mission is to help the chemical industry in its green and digital transition. So what was the context that led us to the creation of the company? Let's say the situation in the chemical industry is basically that most things are done experimentally. So this means that each idea that you have needs to be synthesized and tested in the laboratory. This leads to a trial and error approach, which is very inefficient. So you have many wrong, or let's say bad experiments, and importantly, you hardly learn from bad outcomes. Okay, and also we typically experience very long queue times for synthesis and testing. So often companies are limited by their lab capacity, so they have more ideas that they can actually test in the lab, and then eventually bring new materials, new products to the market. So overall, the conclusion that we had was that with increasing innovation and the sustainability requirements that we have these days, this experimental trial and error has become too slow, too costly, and too inefficient. And so this brings us to the alternative to this experimental approach, which is digital chemistry, so digital technologies for chemical R&D. As you can see here on the left side, there are many different, let's say, technologies that are used in this context. Not all of them apply to our field, so we are just focusing on the pillar here at the right, so on simulation, on artificial intelligence, and on cloud. The cloud we can leave it out for today, as the main topic is artificial intelligence. And how can we use this to offer services? So first of all, we can visualize and understand the relevant chemical space. So this actually is already very important because, as said, the companies often have many different ideas, but they don't know how they are connected. Maybe many molecules that they have in mind are very similar, and it's not worth testing all of them. Maybe they have some areas of the chemical space which are completely empty, and they should populate them. So here we can already help. We can use artificial intelligence to make prediction of properties, right? We can also identify structure-activity relationships. So this means we cannot just make a prediction and say a specific molecule, a specific material works or does not work, but we can also say why. What are the main, let's say, for instance, functional groups that are responsible for a specific property. And also we can prioritize experimental work. That's an important point. We don't claim that we can replace experiments. We always want to complement them. So this means that using artificial intelligence, we can give experimentalists also insights on where they should look. So where should they search for new molecules? Which experiment should they perform in order to get most benefit? This sounds very nice. So you might ask, why aren't we just a pure artificial intelligence company? And well, the reason is simple, that we don't have enough data. So that's really the main problem of our business, of, let's say, the chemical industry, that data is very rare. We have not that much data, and the data that you have is often coming from different sources, is of bad quality. So overall, it's very hard to do machine learning with data that we find in literature or that comes from experiments from our customers. So therefore, we have come to the conclusion that the best approach is to generate the data on our own via simulation. So that's why we combine artificial intelligence with molecular modeling. With molecular modeling, you don't depend on data. You can characterize any molecule that you want, any material on the computer from scratch. You just need the chemical structure, and then you can model it. In this way, it's also possible to reproduce conditions that are very hard to do experimentally. So if, for instance, if you need data at high temperature or high pressure, you can model that. It's also very straightforward to automate the screening. So this means that we can really generate a high throughput data of hundreds of molecules, and in this way generate data for the machine learning models. And eventually, since we are using atomistic modeling, we really have a very deep insight. So it's like a most powerful microscope. You can really look at each atom of our system and understand why something works or why a specific molecule does not work. So how can we then accelerate the R&D of our customers? So basically, in the traditional lab, the one that they are used to, well, they have some ideas, then they have to synthesize and test them experimentally. And this loop, well, is very slow, because as you might imagine, synthesizing every single idea that you have takes a lot of time, then carrying out the experiments as well. And then often the result is not the one that you expected. So you have to go back and cycle this loop. And well, the number of candidates that you can test here is limited, takes a lot of time, and eventually, until you really get a convincing result, a good product that you can bring to market, well, easily 10 years or more can elapse, and that's too much. With our approach, let's say we also do a feedback loop, a trial and error loop, but the difference is that this is done digital. So this means that we can really explore many different candidates in a virtual screening loop. And in this way, only the most promising candidates go then actually to the synthesis and validation step. So this validation still has to be done experimentally, but since we can apply this powerful screening filter, we can focus the experiment, or our clients can focus the experiments only on the most promising candidates. And in this way, they save a considerable amount of time and money, and in this way can bring their products to market in a shorter time. Good. So we are mainly working on two segments, namely polymers and surfactants. This might sound very limited, but actually these chemistries are present in many different products in many different sectors. And now I will follow with some specific use cases. So these are not just theoretical exercises, but these are really concrete projects, concrete demands that we have received from our customers and that we have been able to solve with our techniques. Before we go to the use cases, just here a few numbers. So these are numbers that we got from our clients, what they said. With digital approaches, you can accelerate your innovation by a factor of 5 and reduce cost by a factor of 9. These are specific numbers. This is not specific to artificial intelligence, it's just overall to digital chemistry. But just to show you that the industry has realized the benefits of digital approaches, and many companies are now trying to move their R&D activities also in that direction. So now these use cases, as said, we are working in many different sectors. The first one, where we have actually a lot of many applications, is personal care. In many products that we use for personal care, they use polymers. So, for instance, in hair care products, whatever, you have polymers that are in solution, and then these polymers eventually, when you take a shower, for instance, they you are rinsed off by the water, and eventually they end up in the ocean. And these polymers often are not very green. And that's a huge problem for the environment. So therefore, many companies are trying to replace established polymers by biodegradable alternatives. Something similar happens in home care industry. So here, for instance, laundry, the objective would be to come up with better, in this case, often surfactants, so that are greener, that work at lower dosage. Also here, the objective again is to reduce the amount of chemicals that go to the wastewater and eventually to the ocean. And the third big line where we are working on is food industry. So as you all know, many food is covered by plastic in order to protect it. The problem is that we often have toxic molecules within that plastic that can migrate, and of course that's a big problem because these toxic molecules can eventually reach the food that we eat, and of course this is a big problem. So it's not just that the plastic as such is a problem due to environmental concerns, but it can also be a problem actually for human health. When a customer comes to us with such specific problems, typically what we have to do is to kind of condense his demand to something that we can model. So what we want to try or model or predict with artificial intelligence. So we need some descriptors that we can predict. And here are some specific examples. These are all real cases that we have worked on. So the first one about the additive in plastics. So in plastics, basically, these are polymer matrices. Here, the question is the diffusion. So what's the diffusion of molecules in these polymeric matrices? This is something that we can model, and this data that we can generate can then also be used for a machine learning model. Experimentally, it's very hard to measure actually diffusion. So what people do here, they just put the plastic in contact with food or a food simulant, and they wait, and well, they have to wait sometimes for 2 months, and then they see whether the molecule has reached the food. Of course, then after 2 months, you realize that indeed you had a bad material, and then you have to start over again. And here we can shorten this time because with our approach, within a few days, we can provide the client with an answer. I said home care, so detergents. Here we are looking at things like critical micelle concentration, surface tension, interfacial tensions. These are quantities that can be modeled and can then also, the data can be used to train machine learning model. Again, here it would be very, very difficult to gather data on that from experiments or from literature because it's the approaches that are used are so different. It's so heterogeneous that it's really difficult to create here a sound model based on that data. Another example comes from the oil and gas industry. So here we were working on agglomeration inhibitors for flow assurance. We were looking at adsorption and agglomeration barriers. These are also things that are very hard to, let's say, isolate experimentally, because here the experiments are very complex, kind of mixing several phenomena. But with our modeling and AI approach, we can really focus on these specific descriptors. Other examples are cooling resins for electronics. Here, the challenge is that you have to develop a material that, on the one hand, has a high thermal conductivity so that it can cool the device, the electronic device, but on the other hand, it must be an electrical insulator because otherwise the product doesn't work. So I have here these competing properties. And also here with our digital approach, we can provide answers faster than experiments. Another example is to the encapsulation of active ingredients. So this is the food or also pharmaceutical industry. So the idea is that you swallow an active ingredient, and then in your stomach, kind of the shell, which is typically a polymeric shell, is dissolved, and the active ingredients can be taken up by your body. Last example on that slide is again from the personal care industry. As said here, many polymers are used in cosmetics. They are often fuel-based, and the challenge here is to replace them by greener alternatives. And so actually on this specific example, I have later on more detailed use case, because this is a very nice example of how we combined modeling and artificial intelligence to provide answer to the client. Just to continue, a few other use cases to show you that really the applications are very broad. One example was to study the microplastic formation in polymer 3D particles. Again, this comes from personal care. The problem here is that the client had to cover the surface of small particles with a polymeric shell in order to modify the properties. And the problem is that if this surface coverage is very uniform, it might be considered as microplastic, and therefore it might be prohibited in the future. And this is something that can't be studied experimentally. So the advantage of our atomistic simulations in that case is that you can get direct insight into the structure of that surface. In this case, it's a more phenomenological description, but just to show you some additional applications. Also, very hot topics in personal care is silicon chemistries. So as for the polymers, for the fuel-based polymers, this is a chemistry that should be replaced by something more sustainable. And also here we can characterize the silicons and then search for alternatives combining machine learning and modeling. We have also worked in the automotive sector. Namely, we have worked on lubricant additives. So as you might imagine, in an engine, it's very important that the components of the engine can work with as little friction as possible. And therefore, we have friction modifiers that adsorb onto the surface of the moving pieces, and in this way reduce the friction, and making in this way the engine more efficient. We have also worked on soot dispersants. This is a problem in combustion engine, that soot particles can reduce modify the properties of oil, for instance, and in this way reduce the efficiency of the engine. And finally, to close this list, we have also worked with pigments. So here the challenge is to replace toxic elements in pigments by more sustainable, more greener alternatives, but without affecting the color shade of the pigment. So overall, let's say you can see we always try to make the products that our clients sell more sustainable, so that they are less harmful for the environment, that they come from sustainable sources. And we are convinced that here digital chemistry, digital R&D is a key to achieve this goal. So now let's explain in more detail the specific use case. So I said this is from the personal care industry, specifically hair care products. And here the challenge was to find new biopolymers with a specific glass transition temperature. So glass transition temperature, right? This is the temperature where a polymer transitions from a brittle state to a more rubbery state. And this, you can measure that in principle, just as you might imagine. Doing an extensive screening of hundreds, maybe thousands of new polymers is absolutely impossible with experimental means. So we could do this with just simulations. Here we could model 10,000 polymers. Yes, we could, but it also would take a lot of time. So we said, well, we should combine this with artificial intelligence. So what did we do? We first generated a very large number of polymers, but just virtually, right? Many 10,000 polymers. You can see them here as these dots in this space. So every dot here corresponds to a specific polymer. And then we applied unsupervised machine learning in order to identify clusters, or to clusterize that the data set. And in this way, we could come up with about 500 polymers that uniformly covered this chemical space. So now 500 polymers, this is something that we can model. It might take a few weeks, but we could generate these 500 data points. So we determined the glass transition temperature for these 500 polymers. And then with these 500 data points, we could train a machine learning model that can now be used to predict the glass transition temperature, not just for these 500 polymers, but for 10,000, 20,000, 100,000, many polymers that are from that chemical space. So now we had at our disposal a model that can really within seconds make you a prediction of the glass transition temperature. And of course, this is an extremely powerful tool for pre-screening, because if you have just a new idea of a polymer, you pass it through this machine learning model, and within seconds, you have the prediction of the glass transition temperature. So here are just the numbers. I said overall, we modeled a bit more than 500 polymers with several replicas. So this gives us quite an extensive simulation time overall for those of you who are familiar with molecular dynamics simulation. And well, the question is, could we do this also without modeling, just with artificial intelligence? Could we find 500 glass transition temperatures from the literature? Probably not. It's extremely hard to find consistent data in the literature. And if we ask an experimentalist whether he could do 500 experiments in a consistent way, well, the answer is yes, but maybe it would take several years. So of course, this is not practical for our purpose. So overall, we think that in such situation, really the only way is to generate the data with simulations, and in this way populate the chemical space and have enough data to train the model. And as you can see, the final result that we got is something really quite nice. We have a model that can predict the glass transition temperature with an error of less than 20 degrees. So to close, why do we think that now is the time to really combine artificial intelligence and modeling via high-performance computing? Basically, because the computers are evolving really at a breathtaking speed. So computational power is doubling roughly every 2 years. So that's really, well, an exponential growth. If you imagine a modern smartphone is more powerful than the world's largest supercomputers back in the 90s, which actually is not that far away, right? So 25, 30 years, what was occupying a full floor, like you see here on the right, is now fitting into your pocket. And this enormous, let's say, progress of the computational capacity is really enabling us to do now calculations that wouldn't have been possible some years ago. And in this way, we can generate the data that we need to train the machine learning models that we need for our clients. And that's it, all I wanted to tell you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stefan. So I'm just checking to see if we have any questions. If not, I'll use an executive privilege, and that's the first one. And so both presentations actually drill down the fact that one way of actually addressing the issue of lack of data for building these models is using simulations, right? And so either by quantum chemistry or of molecular dynamics and so on. This is one part. So for both of you, so what do you think about other approaches that people have been trying for synthetic data, like looking at data, you look at the distributions and trying to actually generate more data that actually follows the structure of the data sets that you already have. Is that something that is actually viable in these particular spaces, or is it something that still needs to be addressed and maybe we need more work on it? Go ahead, Johannes, or...
Okay, so I'm not quite sure if I understood the question correctly.
So the idea is that synthetic data could be, many things. One of the ways to approach that is using simulations, but the other one is actually looking at real measurements, right? And then what you do is trying to actually generate, you look at the distribution and the structure of the data, and then using statistical analysis, you're trying to, generate new data sets that go beyond what you have there based on this, as long as it follows the distributions. This is something that is being practiced currently, but I don't know if that's actually good enough for the kind of things that you guys are doing.
So yes and no. Okay, so yes, we are using. Okay, so you can't make up data from thin air, right? So if you've got data, just because you know what kind of distribution it belongs to, you can define, okay, where there's missing data and what kind of data you should add in order to come to a more complete and comprehensive data set. And so for that, a statistic analysis is definitely useful. Kind of the other part is kind of using kind of the distribution and the kind of knowledge of the distribution. That is actually a machine learning or data mining approach by itself, right? So trying to fill in the gaps and then making predictions about those gaps, that would be a machine learning task in itself. Yeah, so that would be my take on that.
Stefan?
Yes, so let's say we also have the problem that often, let's say, what is limited data, what is much data is very kind of hard to. We have different, let's say, levels of understanding what is much data or little data. So also when we discuss with our clients, they say, well, sometimes we have a lot of data. Well, we did a lot of experiments. We cannot do more. And then they say, ask, well, how many data points do you have? And then they say, maybe, well, really a lot, at least 20 or 30 or so. And really generating more data without a labeling, so without a value attached to it, it's not useful for us. We need really a measurement. And well, when we ask the client, could you do more measurement? It's really very hard. So that's why we are convinced that the only way to really increase the size of the data set is with simulations. But well, if I understood correctly your question, so generating more data without any new information attached to it is not really useful for us.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Quick follow up on this. I encounter this actually quite often when I teach this in introductory classes. So kind of let's say we've got an incomplete data set, and oftentimes, let's say there's certain features missing. So there's actually data on let's say new molecules, but let's say one feature vector is incomplete. And maybe a couple of these feature vectors are incomplete. Now, so kind of my students have just discovered the imputer function. So well, so there are gaps in data. Let's just use the imputer function and then just fill in those gaps. And they're clever algorithms to basically do that. So interpolate or use some other algorithms. And that's fine to a certain degree if kind of the actual data that you have, the information that you have is the majority. And so you're basically just filling in small gaps in order to not have to discard entire parts of the data set. But remember, so I mean, if you're using this imputer function, you're actually later on building a machine learning model on made up data. There's actually no solid foundation there. So that's why one has to be a bit more careful. And so the other aspect again is about different problems need different data demands. So another example I use in my introductory class is, let's say, imagine that Isaac Newton was a data scientist, and so he's trying to develop kind of the laws of motion, and he somehow can kind of for his apples, he can get the mass of the apples and the force with which they're being accelerated. But after 3 data points, he figures out that they're all on one line, and after 10 data points, he's perfectly convinced of that. So you really needed only 10 data points in that particular featureization, using kind of knowing the mass and the force, to have a perfect linear regression model. Now, so if he chosen a different featureization, that would be a completely different story. So you would need more data, or again, so if he's got more difficult laws to describe that are nonlinear, then again, so you need more data. So it really depends on the kind of the things that you're trying to model, the featureization, and the kind of the model type you're building in order to assess the data demands.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think I agree with what you guys are saying. I actually tried, Johannes, you might appreciate this. I tried to actually look at the correlation energies, right, from 500 molecules. And then I tried to use one of these methods for looking at the distribution without doing further calculations. And the results were not really that good. So even for for correlation energies that were supposed to be within the scope. It's not even, it's an interpolation piece. It's not even extrapolation. And it didn't work that well. So,
right. So, but the point here is that you're actually building a quite simplistic model,
Yeah,
right? So there are actually quite successful ways of predicting correlation energies based on weakly correlated results that can be quite successful. But yeah, so simple interpolation is maybe not the way to go.
No. All right. So we have a question from the audience, and thank you both for your answers. Bill Dobb asked, will the evolution into quantum computers facilitate this work?
Yeah, well,
You want to take that one, Stefan?
Well, maybe instead of answering the question, should say, will the evolution into quantum computers ever arrive? Maybe that's the other question. Let me say, I would say quantum computers are very powerful tools, but they're very specific. So there are a few tasks that you can really calculate much better than you could do with the classical computers, but they're not everything. So I think we shouldn't think that quantum computers will just solve everything and flood the world with data. In the same as I think we can't expect that artificial intelligence will solve all problems of humankind. So I think each technique has its specific field of applicability. And therefore, I think also quantum computers will not wipe out the problem of data that we need for our models.
Yeah, so I would agree with Stefan that there are basically two aspects of this, right? So how long is it going to take to have a practical quantum computer that can actually do this? So again, that time window might be pretty far off, at least for stuff like routine applications. It's going to be one additional tool, and so using kind of AI. I mean, there's quantum machine learning these days as a separate field that will be able to do certain things that we can't really do easily on a classical computer. An interesting thing is that on a quantum computer, we may actually be able to solve the Schrödinger equation for molecular problems in a quite reasonable amount of time. So we may not actually need this shortcut of using AI anymore. So we may actually just simulate quantum systems on a quantum computer in polynomial or maybe linear time, and then again, so we don't really need that shortcut anymore because we can get really quick results, first principles results, without the use of AI, which would be very exciting for quantum chemists, but it would also put us out of work in a certain sense.
Well, there have been already algorithms put there by Gusu for full CI for very small molecules, right? Things like that. But the other thing that is actually interesting about this question is, it is indeed possible to actually adopt a hybrid approach where you can actually use the classical, simulations of the AI piece, as the other piece is what you have to do very important and very fast and complicated computations on the quantum computer. And this is something that people have been toying around with for a while. I do have a question also from Nikki Paul. It's a long question. Let me see if I can read it. Please. So Dr. Hatchman makes a call for computer scientists to develop better methods for small data sets. Given that machine learning models are based on statistics, what do you see as a path forward? Chemical reaction outcomes can change dramatically just with small variations, such as temperature or methyl group, whatever. Is there any way to not miss these outliers?
Okay, there are a couple of questions in there. Okay, so the first one is, okay, so so all machine learning models are based on statistics. Well, yeah, so that's correct. The question is how do we best do this? And again, so the people who are actually, I mean, we're end users of machine learning and AI at the end of the day. So the computer scientists have paved the way. So we now have to make these tools work in our domain, which is hard enough. Again, I mean, so the underlying fundamental math is there. So I don't necessarily think that there's anything coming on kind of in addition to that. Although I mean, so hardware may actually change somewhat of the playing field, right? So I mean, the reason why we haven't been using neural networks in the 80s, where they're already known, was that we didn't have powerful GPUs, right? So, and that's why they're really popular these days. So hardware is definitely one thing that's going to change things. And again, so the design of new algorithms, right? So I think, and then there needs to be an incentive. And again, so my feeling is right now that for the computer science scientists, there's not much incentive because they're low-hanging fruit where there's just tons and tons of data, and there's also money, right? So in banking, the example that I mentioned, there's just so much money. Why focus on chemistry that's complicated and there's no money in there when you can work with banks that have tons of data and they pay you handsomely? So there was another part of the question. What was the second part? Oh yeah, right. Sorry. Missing things. There's definitely always kind of the danger of missing things. I think the opposite is more impressive. So so machine learning has been able to predict close to, so near chaotic systems where you've got physical systems with exponentially divergent trajectories, and you could still, I mean, so if you see the data sets, if you see plots of the data set, you don't see any patterns in there. But machine learning was actually still able to find those. A really nice example that really got me started in the early days was work by Hort Lipson when he was still back in Cornell, where he basically had motion tracking on physical systems. And so one of them that he had was a double harmonic pendulum, and he had motion tracking on this. And so if you look at the data for the motions of the pendulum, you couldn't see any patterns. But so he was able to use a machine learning algorithm, in that case, a symbolic regression approach, to come up with the underlying Newtonian laws, including the arm length of the double pendulum and the initial conditions. And so you could actually model and recover Newton's equations of motion from a close to chaotic system. So those have been really exciting cases. Now, can you overlook things? Definitely, right? So in particular cases where you don't really have much training data, again, so making predictions that are very strongly extrapolative, that's just hard, and you can definitely miss things.
Stefan?
I think, yeah, I think you should never blindly trust the prediction that the model makes. It's a tool like others that help you to speed up your work to be more efficient. But I would never blindly trust a prediction made by the model without kind of common sense to see whether the prediction that is made it looks reasonable or not.
I mean, I get often asked, is it going to replace kind of traditional modeling, or is it going to replace experimentalists? No, it's one more tool in the toolbox that we have at our disposal. We have to use it carefully and thoughtfully. Then it provides added value. But again, so at the end of the day, the rubber hits the road when you actually make a new compound, if you're making a new material, and that happens in the lab by someone. And so ultimately, we're not going to get rid of all these other people.
Yeah.
It's still going to be just
you would
one
never
tool
board a
in the
plane that's just modeled on the computer, right? You want to be sure that
Yeah.
it has been really flew by somebody, right?
Well, talking about that, given that all this big thing about large language models and talking about delusion and getting really untrustworthy data, what do you guys think about the use of large language models, like maybe fine-tuned to actually generate more data for building other models? Is that something viable nowadays?
Yeah, I can maybe get started on this. So personally, I think that kind of what makes so Stefan made this very nice point that we're not really doing AI, we're really doing machine learning, and so for the most part, that's actually the case, right? So building these fast prediction models is really what we are after. This added component of having kind of intuitive inputs and intuitive outputs, that's a nice bonus feature which can be helpful. But at the end of the day, I can do without those. Now, so there are a couple of people who are actually pushing this and quite successfully, and they've been really nice examples of kind of natural queries like, so can Gabe Gomez, for instance, has a very nice example of this. He's at Carnegie Mellon. So he can basically write an input, tell me a synthesis recipe for this molecule, and basically at the end of the day, it spits out a suggestion for that. So that it's quite nice. But so my personal focus is more on the inlets, on the prediction models that are at the heart of that. So the hallucination is kind of an interesting thing. It's basically a bad prediction, right? So an extrapolative bad prediction, but because we're getting that bad prediction in human interpretable output, it just sounds weird, or it conveys this wrong results in a very convincing fashion. And that's basically what it is, a bad prediction. And again, so machine learning models can make bad predictions, but again, so if it's speaking in a human voice, it comes with a certain level of authority that again, so we interpret as hallucination or bullshitting, which is a technical term. So AI models that do these things.
Yeah, based on your criteria, that we all scientists actually hallucinate one way or the other, right?
Yeah. We're making bad calls every once in a while, and
Right.
the better scientists, a few of those.
Absolutely. Stefan?
Yeah, I would also say for us, it's more important to have high quality data than just a lot of data points. So we focus on quality than of quantity, because as discussed, I mean, anyway, we are used to work with small data sets. And so I prefer to have 500 data points of high quality that I can use than 5,000 that are crap. So therefore, we never work with such models. Just maybe we could try one day, but so far we haven't tried it yet, because we don't think that it gives much benefit to our work.
So based on, talking about quality, so what does that mean for you? I mean, there is the issue with accuracy or reliability, right? You can actually be very accurate and then miss the trends. And sometimes what you need is actually, for the things that you guys are doing, Stefan, are very big systems. Maybe you don't need that much accuracy. What you need is actually a reliable method that can tell you the trends of what's going on. So how do you see that playing in your areas?
Yeah, maybe accuracy is not a good term. Actually, I should call it consistent. So what's important that it is consistent. If we have a constant error, that's fine, because, well, we can still make relative comparison. We can still tell a good prediction is, well, or a bad prediction. But it's important that we have consistent data, and that's actually the problem, that when we gather data from literature, from as you said, Johannes, you have this bias also that only good data is published. Then the data comes from many different sources. So it's for us, it's more important, let's say, to have consistent data. And here again, maybe I repeat myself, but we think that here simulation is really a good way to generate consistent data. Because if you tell the computer the same input, it will give you the same simulation output, ideally, of course. So in this way, it's really, I can be sure that Carlos, Johannes, and myself, we generate consistent data if we use the same input, the same approach.
Johannes?
Yeah, so one more way of seeing this is systematic errors and random errors, right? So as long as you've got systematic errors, I don't mind the errors, because if as long as they're systematic, you can relatively easily correct for them. So random errors are much more difficult to deal with. Now, so I don't necessarily 100% agree with Stefan on the low quality versus high quality data. I mean, there's, again, so I think it's hard to state this generally. Again, so if I have the choice of having a lot of data that's of high quality, okay, I always take that. But again, so you can use techniques to bridge that gap. So so one study we did, which was really successful, is a study where we could generate a lot of low quality DFT results, kind of small bases, simple functional. And we had a small amount of high quality data. So we did kind of more advanced DFTs, like double hybrid DFT, but we also did this with coupled cluster theory. And again, so you can, so that data that we had at the high level of theory wouldn't have been enough to build a proper machine learning model. But so we could use transfer learning. So basically, we built a neural network model based on the cheap data, and then we use transfer learning to basically learn the difference between the simple theory and the more advanced theory. And so basically, for a fraction of the cost, you get a machine learning model that has roughly the accuracy of the expensive data. And that actually works surprisingly well. So again, so I think it's hard to say, generally speaking, okay, so do you do quality over quantity? It really depends on how bad the data is. Again, so random errors are an issue, but kind of unknown randomness, right? So again, biases that are incorrect. So right, so if you're yeah, anyway, so it's a lot of stuff that's complicated. But if you've got systematic differences between data, those you can always correct for using machine learning. That's one of the strengths. So basically, the machine learning algorithm learns the difference between, let's say, high quality data and low quality data.
So following with that, I mean, listen, my life here, we really worry about uncertainties when we do measurements here on this, right? So, and one of the things that came to mind is, well, how do you actually, in particular, not only just get the uncertainties, which is, okay, it's actually the budget, the uncertainty budget. Where do things are, like you're talking into your hands, where do things come from? Now, so obviously you can look at the data that you have and sort of understand that the data that you're using to build the models. But if you actually look at black boxes like neural nets, how do you assess the uncertainty budgets, the reasons why the things are happening when actually you get to final results? Sometimes, and most of the time actually, you see that the uncertainties of the predictions don't really map directly to uncertainties of the data that you're using to fit in the model, because the model implicitly has some biases. So, and these things are very, very complicated to treat because they are black boxes. So do you guys think that we'll be able to actually solve this issue soon?
Yeah, I mean, I can give a stab at this. So you mentioned a couple of different points. So there's the uncertainties of the input that you have of the training data. So yeah, I mean, there's ongoing research. I mean, so you can work with incorporating your error bars into the loss function. You can incorporate the error bars into your training. So you give data points with small error bars larger a priori weight rather than giving them, and you give kind of low quality data lesser weight. And then the predictions of the outputs. Now the outputs is basically kind of the errors of the models. Now, so there, I think one important point to recognize is that you should always assess an entire battery of metrics for error. So I always get annoyed when I see, okay, well, this is the mean absolute error of my model. Well, that's one metric, right? So I mean, the mean error would tell you something about kind of, do you have trends in the data, right? So I mean, so is this a balanced error? Is it unbalanced error? So the R square is an important metric, but again, so percentage errors are important. Again, so we always generate automatically a full battery of different metrics of errors that tell you different things, and I think that's an important one. But generally speaking, once you have settled on a validation or on a testing strategy, also basically you get the error metrics for your model, and to the best of your knowledge, that's the errors that you get for your prediction. Now, so the third issue you raised is the issue of interpretability and gaining insights. And so while traditionally machine learning models are black box, I mean, there are these days techniques to basically open up that black box and try to learn something about the models themselves. So how do those models actually work? How do they come to the predictions they make? But you can also learn something about individual and specific predictions they make. So why does this model for this particular molecule make those predictions? And again, so that's this field of XAI, so explainable artificial intelligence, that basically allows you to open up the black box of AI, and it's very useful and very straightforward. Well, not very straightforward, but reasonably straightforward for neural network models. What really remains on that front is that just because you're opening up the black box and so you get explanations for how the model works, those explanations are the explanations for the causality, for the correlations that are at the heart of these models. They're not necessarily explanations for the underlying causalities. So that's another layer of that you have to peel back, not just to explain the causalities that are being used and exploited in those models, but also to understand the causalities that underlie those correlations. And again, so that's I think a front that there's a lot of room for improvements there.
Thanks. Stefan?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, apart from just looking at the errors of the model, we should also take into account the domain of applicability of the model. So you can have an extremely good, accurate model, but if you use it on data that lies outside of that range, it will not work. If you have a model for dogs and you apply it to cats, well, the predictions are maybe not very trustworthy here. In order to, and the other point about interpretation of the models also, we don't use very complex models. We use relatively simple models, and also, well, apart from, let's say, they are much easier to or faster to train. Also, the insights, sometimes it's easier to understand them, what's actually going on. It's not black box models, but you can also really learn from the model. How does it make the prediction, and maybe this also then gives you some insights on how to design better chemistries.
Thank you. So the next question, I think we have a question from the audience. I think this is actually Mike Janicki. Mike, do you wanna pose your question since you have access to the chat?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, so it's I'm interested, you're talking about like, the models and the data. Do you ever get to the point where you kind of get the wrong answer? And how do you decide I had the wrong data or I have to go back and change the model? I mean, is that something you guys run across in your work? Thanks. Out.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of going to what Stefan said before, right? So again, if you've got a good model, it can still fail if you are using it outside the range of applicability. So I actually showed this little picture in my presentation. Kind of, I didn't really discuss this, but so let's say you have training data, you're building a model. So the picture I actually showed was for the index of refraction of polymers. It's kind of a project we had for a while. And again, so we are looking for kind of high refractive index polymers, so polymers that are really on the edge of this model going into the extrapolative regime. Our model just starts to get really bad because we don't really have any training data in that regime. So, and that becomes complicated because you then have to basically build a model that may become worse, but performs better in the domain that you're actually interested in the extreme value regime that you're actually interested in, and that's a compromise you have to build. And there are different strategies of how you can go about this, but basically that's basically what it is. Right. So yeah. So typically, again, so if you get error metrics for your model, that's basically for the area it's trained in, because the testing space and the training space is typically the same. If you've got bad results, again, can be outliers, or they can just be outside the range of applicability of the model. Both can happen.
Yeah. So in general, you have to find a compromise between the generality of the model and predictive accuracy. So having both is difficult. So either you're very good in a specific range of the chemical space, let's say, or you aim at something more general. But then, yeah, it's maybe the predictive accuracy is going down. But also just identifying something as wrong. I mean, that's also already difficult because the model makes a prediction. You don't know whether it's correct or wrong, unless you have a reference or you test it with different means. But a priori, you just have a prediction, nothing else.
So to give you an example of how you can actually do this, so if you're building a model, again, so let's say in the case that I mentioned, so the index of refraction using kind of a physics-based modeling, so combination of DFT and MD. So you get a as in you're building a model, you're making a prediction. And what you can then do is, well, so you can, so for all these newly predicted compounds, you can then go back and say, okay, these are the kind of the high refractive index, let's say polymers that we are really interested in. So we go back and then redo the calculations, the physics-based calculations. And what we can then do is, well, if the results were great, then our model apparently still works where we are trying to employ it. If it doesn't work, we can feed that data back into the machine learning model. So we retrain the model so that it becomes better in predicting these extreme value ranges. Now, what you're then doing is you're biasing your model. It's not going to be perfectly calibrated, but it will perform better in the extreme value range where you're actually interested in using the model. But yeah, so it might work worse for other areas, so for other value regimes.
Thank you. So let me remind the audience that the question and answers, are already open. So if you want to submit your questions, so we can actually discuss and pass it to the panel. But in the meantime, I will give the opportunity to the co-organizer of the webinar, Jonathan. Jonathan, you have any questions?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I do. So when do you know if your data is limited? I guess it's more of a philosophical question, or do you always assume that data is limited because we must assume it? Is there a way to somehow assess upfront whether this approach is a worthwhile investment, right? Will it return the gaps that I think there might be in my data? Is that too abstract a question? No? You can answer it.
Well,
Do you want to go first, Stefan?
well, I said it's maybe a philosophical question whether data is always limited. I mean, you have yes, it's a finite set of data points, so by definition, it's always limited. So maybe the limitation is actually rather, can you go beyond that limit? Can you increase the data set, right? Maybe that's actually the limitation that we suffer. Whether we can assess upfront whether our data set is enough or not, well, before, no, I think that's very hard. We have maybe some experience from past other application, let's say, but if you give me a certain number of data points and tell me, ask me if this is enough or not, I cannot answer until I really train a model based on that data and use it.
Right, and that can be a recipe for actually doing this, right? So as I mentioned, so you can do an on-the-fly observation of the learning rate. So so because the data generation is typically the bottleneck, you can say that, well, so let's say we have a certain amount of data which is limited, and then the question is it enough? And well, so you can build a machine learning model based on the data. So you can assess it. You can get error and prediction errors for that model using kind of different metrics. And then you keep generating more data, and then you retrain the model, and you retrain the model, and retrain the model, and you see how the error metrics change. And so again, so ideally, the more you learn, the better the model should become. But at some point, the model is saturated. So there's adding more data will not improve the model. And then basically, the model has learned whatever it can learn from the data, and then you may as well stop generating more data. And then you've got enough data. Now, so that's maybe not a global statement, but that would be the answer, that you have enough data for a given featurization and a given model architecture, because that's typically something you wouldn't necessarily change. Now, in principle, you can also change that, but then it becomes a high-dimensional optimization problem. And so there are auto machine learning approaches that can also optimize the featurization and the hyperparameters and the model selection. But that's something you don't typically want to do on the fly. So again, so the learning rate assessment that you can typically do on the fly as long as you've decided on a particular featurization, a particular model architecture.
No, that's very interesting. Thank you. It leads me to another thought. I work in industry, right? So commerciality is always a concern, and it seems, challenging to, or you have to be courageous, right? To perhaps go out and take an in silico approach, like you describe, Stefan, yeah, to develop chemistry, etc. Could you talk, maybe to you, Stefan? Could you talk about how do you manage that financial risk with your clients? How do you convince them that not that you're going to get a return on that? That was a poor question, first of all, that I asked, I guess, right? But how do you convince them to take that courageous step? And spend those hard-earned dollars to then,
Well, I have the feeling that at some point we hit the pain point of the customer. So they just hit a wall. They realize that they are too slow developing new products, and they have to search for an alternative. So typically they do also, I mentioned, broad scouting for looking for alternatives, and digital science or digital chemistry is one approach that they can try out. And let's say it's a risk, but you can also have a high, let's say, return if things goes well. So typically that's kind of we start with relatively small projects. So we don't start with $1 million project. We start with something small, where we can quickly show the customer whether there is a return on investment, let's say. And in this way, convince then the client that that they should continue with digital chemistry. And actually, more and more, we don't have to convince people. So actually, they are approaching us because they are realizing that just with a traditional experimental approach, they are too slow. So they're realizing that they need to try new things, and so they ask us, how can you help us with digital science? So in the, let's say, 5 years ago, maybe it was the other round. We had to convince people to go into digital. Now it's all the other way around. They realize that they have to go into digital, and they ask us, how can we actually do that?
Yeah, I would, again, so I'm not in industry, but so my experience with collaborating with industry and also other academic groups it's kind of the value proposition is the other way around, right? So doing Edisonian experiments, so by trial and error, that's a really expensive thing to do, right? Because you're doing all these experiments, they're all really expensive, they're time consuming, there's all sorts of stuff that can go wrong, and there's very little guarantee if any of that's going to work out. And that can be a real time and money thing. Now, if you can work with a computational person, be that physics-based modeling or AI modeling, and you can narrow down your search space and you can identify kind of high priority targets to actually try in the lab, that is a real value proposition because the calculations are typically much faster, much cheaper than doing all the experiments and then failing in all of them.
And just importantly, we don't claim that we can replace experiments. We want to complement them. We want to make them better, more effective, more efficient, let's say. And in this way, typically, as you said, Johannes, industry has realized that.
So I think where it's qualitatively different is again, so going from a purely Edisonian approach, or maybe not purely Edisonian, it's not purely trial and error, but people have intuition about kind of which systems work, and they've got certain heuristic and certain conceptual views of what should work, and then we try this as the next thing. But if you can underpin this in a more quantitative fashion using these machine learning models, and you can make predictions first on the computer that are reliable to a certain degree, and you can do this again, so in an afternoon or so, rather than have 2 months or so, some grad student in the lab try this out. There's a real value proposition here.
Right. So I think we have 4 more minutes. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, we have about 4 more minutes, and
All right.
I don't know if we want to close at this point and give our speakers each maybe 90 seconds. What do you see as the future? Like where do you want?
That was going to be my question.
Okay.
To close out. So what's up there? What's the future? That's a very good question to close. Thank you, Mike.
Well, yeah, prediction about the future are always very difficult, no? Well, what I'm convinced of, and I think everybody here, is that artificial is something that has come and will stay. I am not 100% sure whether it will really solve all of our challenges, all of our problems. I rather personally think it will be one tool as many others. Let's say maybe it's like internet. What would we do today without internet? But still, we cannot do everything with internet. So I think with AI will be similar. It will be a crucial tool for research, but it will be a tool that coexists with other approaches.
Yeah, and I would completely kind of underscore that and support that. Again, so there's still challenges, right? So we're still in the, I mean, so I think a lot of the low-hanging fruits are solved by now, but again, so making AI machine learning work for chemistry more broadly, so complex systems. Again, so kind of a lot of the property predictions, for instance, we have in particular if it's straightforward properties, we have a pretty good grasp on how to do this. So complex properties, complex chemical systems, disordered systems, impurities, doping. So kind of where the chemistry really gets complicated, where it gets messy, interactions with biological systems, physiological activities, so kind of the interface to biochemistry. This is where there's still a lot of stuff to figure out and how to tackle this. But I think we're on a good path. The technical issues that still need to be resolved, and then we just have to get better in solving these more complex, more messy systems that are further away from saying, okay, well, so I've got a small molecule and I want to get a model for the dipole moment. So we can really successfully do this, so we can get the polarizability really successfully. But that's a reasonably simple thing to do.
All right, I think we're coming to the conclusion, and before I pass it back to Mike, I would like to thank both of you for spending your time with us today. This has actually been very illuminating, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank the National Academies for helping us with this, organizing this very nice webinars, particularly Kay, Darlene, and Mike, and my partner in crime is Jonathan Wild, that we actually worked very, very hard to actually put all this together. with that, I'll pass it to you, Mike.
Thanks, Carlos. I think great minds think alike. I was going to thank everybody as well, but you already did that hard job for me. And thank the audience for attending, and join our mailing list. And we will continue this discussion in February with a workshop on artificial intelligence and drug discovery. So thanks everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your Thursday.